Terrific. Let's get started. I wanted to welcome everyone to our first virtual leadership lunch of 2020. I am delighted and honored that we're beginning with Dr. Erica Brown. For those of you who have not had the distinct pleasure of learning with Erica, you're in for just really an inspirational lunch today, lunch or breakfast for those of you calling in from the West Coast. Erica was actually my very first leadership teacher. Erica, I don't even know if you know that, but back when, gosh, I was a young mom and just starting to get more deeply engaged in the Jewish community, I was invited to be in a leadership cohort that Erica was teaching. And it was just a phenomenal experience. I still have the little certificate that she gave out at the end that said, "Hineni, here I am." And I continue to find that inspiring. Erica is the director of the Mayberg Center for Jewish Education and Leadership and an associate professor of curriculum and pedagogy at the JWI University. She is the author of many, many books, but specifically her most recent that she'll be speaking about today, that we sent out the link and we'll share again so that everyone can order, is the Book of Esther, Power, Fate, and Fragility in Exile. So with this, I don't want to delay anymore with our lunch and learn, and I'd like to turn things over to Erica.
Thank you so much, Meredith. It's a pleasure to meet all of you and spend this Purim with a little text study. It's think of it as an intellectual mishloach manot, a little opportunity for pause. I'm going to first ask that everyone mute because there is some background noise. So I'm just going to take a moment. Okay, I could still hear some background noise. So just because it it interferes with the sound quality. So what we're going to do today is talk about a character. I don't know about you, but I remember fondly dressing up as Esther loads of times, even though I was a nerdy, bookish young girl. Purim was my moment to kind of envelop myself in the beauty and shine of a queen. And it's a story, the Book of Esther is a story that also has to grow up with us. And I want to share an observation that's helped me in thinking about Esther from a female empowerment standpoint, is the notion of rereadings, reading a book that we read as children and allowing it to grow up with us. And I'll share an observation from Anne Fadiman, who wrote, it's an excellent writer and wrote a book called Rereadings. It's an anthology of authors who then went back to revisit texts they had seen as children. I might have even mentioned this when I recently met with Meredith and spoke to her, and I'm just so delighted to be working with her again in this capacity. In what Fadiman describes as reading a story that she read as a child and loved. It was a sci-fi book by C.S. Lewis, and she read it to her 8-year-old son. And as she was rereading this book as an adult, having taken a vacation from it for many, many years, decades, she describes the discovery of misogyny and racism in the book that she had not noticed as a child. And she said to her son, "Are you noticing this?" And he said, "Mommy, can we just read the story? Because when you're little, you don't think much about those kind of details." And another essay, beautiful essay in the book, is by the novelist Allegra Goodman. And Goodman writes about rereading Pride and Prejudice as an adult. She talked about her absolute love for this book as an adolescent, and then in college, feeling that she was going to let go of some of these lighter themes of marriage and availability. Again, I'm going to remind all of you to take a pause and mute because there's some notifications there dinging. And so Allegra Goodman describes reading this book and then in college having kind of a breakup with it, like a breakup with a boyfriend, and looking for something which is more sophisticated. P.S. at 29, Allegra Goodman was a young mother and she lost her 51-year-old mother to cancer, and reopened the book of Pride and Prejudice because it was one of her mother's favorites. And as she's reading it, nursing her child, the rain is pouring down, she's actually thinking to herself, you know, I didn't care for this book when I was looking for something darker, but now that I've experienced real darkness in my life, I'm actually looking for something lighter. And so I want to look at the light and dark elements of Esther, particularly as they apply to women. There is a gross violence towards women in this book that many people don't realize because they're taken with the beauty contest that is Esther. In fact, there in Israel, the first beauty contest to take place in the state of Israel was actually named after Esther. I'm not sure that's a legacy she would have wanted to perpetuate, since it was really a Persian custom and not a Jewish one. So let's take a look at this beautiful painting. This is the painting that I wanted for the cover of my book. Instead, I have a more typical composition of Esther in the presence of Haman and Achashverosh. And the publisher felt that this Esther was not really an Esther. You know, if she could have been anyone, people might not have known, just an aristocrat near an estate or a queen near a palace. They might not have seen in Esther an Esther in looking at the cover. And so I think it's a really interesting depiction. Just a few words about Botticelli. Botticelli is a 15th, early 16th century painter. Many of us know him for The Birth of Venus, one of his most famous paintings. He also he did the frescoes on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. We tend to focus on Michelangelo's famous ceiling. But in this painting, Botticelli has captured a very interesting and different moment that's atypical of compositions of Esther, which are usually crowded with people, because the Book of Esther is crowded with people, all kinds of ministers and people who are named but don't do anything, people who are unnamed who populate the palace, as is typical for a court. A lot of people are in a court having different roles. Esther here is in this lonely moment. Now, Botticelli painted this as part of a pair of marriage chests, and the other marriage chest had the triumph of Mordecai. So it was a beautiful gift, a marriage gift. It's not something that you could put on your registry in Bed Bath & Beyond today. It must have been for people who were very wealthy. Botticelli was, his benefactor was the Medici family, so it's very possible that a member of the Medici family was the recipient of these wonderful marriage chests, and Esther is on the second one. So just want to ask you to look at this painting. You're certainly welcome. For those of you familiar with webinars, there's a chat space down below. If you want to drop me a line and tell me what you're noticing in this painting, some features of this painting that you that as you're looking from, let's say, right to left, up to down, how does the painter compose this painting? What are its salient elements? What's unusual about it? So I'll give you a moment to think about it and drop me a note in the chat room if you should so desire. All right, only her dress is a brilliant color, says Nicole, and the rest fades behind her. So beautiful observation that Esther's dress, obviously trying to get us to focus. Esther's also the center of this composition. So if we were to drop a plumb line in the middle, we'd see that Esther is really right there. So she's the focus. The dress actually gets, on all the folds of the dress, shows the expertise of the artist, and also makes us see her as something more brilliant than the surroundings. I see we have a little note from Jane. Hello, Jane. Nice to talk to you. It looks like Esther's outside the city looking in. Clearly, this must be the moment before she enters the palace where things are just going to begin. Lori tells us she's in motion. We can see that because she's lifting her dress to take a step. And thank you for that beautiful observation, Lori. It's hard to communicate motion in a painting, and generally in biblical depictions, and that's true of mythology and history, where there's a story, the eyes, the hands, the feet, the mouth, those are the things that tell the story, almost as if we were to put a little bubble caption, and I'm inviting you to do that. What might Esther be saying with her finger pointed heavenwards and her eyes? What is she saying? And what is she saying as she moves? Sasha mentions the lines of the hills and palace walls. Everything draws your attention to her as well. It's almost as if the topography is, it's high in the back. It's almost like, folding. She's kind of in the valley of this painting. She's lifting up her cumbersome dress to do something that she's not dressed for. Is she possibly rehearsing her speech for the king with her mouth open? Is she talking to herself? Who else may she be talking to? Any other observations? I love all of this. It's terrific. She's talking to God. Okay, so Nicole, I imagine that part of what your response is that she's pointing heavenward. Is she having a conversation with God? And if she were, what might she be saying? So I'd like to offer a few lines. One of them is she's entering to subject herself to a foreign king. Is she taking with her this, it seems that she's born in Jerusalem. She was told by Mordecai not to tell her birthplace. Her uncle Mordecai was part of the exile, is introduced to us as an exile. So there's a sense that she's an otherness. She has otherness. She's not from this place. And is she pointing heavenward to say to God, although I need to subjugate myself to the laws of this king, you are the King of Kings. You are my ultimate authority. I'd also like to observe her foot. Her foot is dark. It's black, and it's pointed, it picks up the blackness of the shadow, and it's pointed to the palace gate, almost as if you could imagine a direct line going from her foot all the way to the palace. And then let's look at her head. You see that little arrow? Her head it looks like it will just fit into the palace gate. So her body is turning, that point of movement, her body is turning towards the palace, but her other foot seems to be dragging behind. And is she, as a young woman, afraid of going into the palace? I imagine that this moment, which will change everything about her life, is surely a time of intimidation, of not understanding what will happen to her when she goes through this palace. There's something else that's very noticeable about this painting, and that is the perspective of the painting. The perspective of the painting is, and you can almost look at her eyes, look like she's overlooking the ramparts of the walls. The palace is very small in relation to her. Now you may just say, the painter is an amateur, but because we know it's Botticelli, we know that that's not the case. The painter has chosen to make Esther larger than her environment, in some ways suggestive that Esther will transcend the place that she's in. She will have to follow rules, but she will also have to teach herself to break rules. And that's going to be a very important message for us as women as we read this book of female empowerment, is knowing when we follow the rules, but also understanding when the rules cease to serve us. In fact, they may even imprison us. They may even hold us back and serve as obstructions. And so we have to learn in some way how to break them. And I say that because there would be no Esther had there not been a Vashti. Vashti is someone I'm very interested in. I spent quite a bit of time, a chapter on her in my book. Vashti was an important icon in the suffragette movement. In fact, Elizabeth Cady Stanton sees her as a suffragette icon. She's a woman who stands up to male dominance because she says, I'm not going to Achashverosh's party. So I just want to make sure we know the storyline. This is the only biblical book where we open up with a party. Achashverosh or Achashverosh in Hebrew. That's a little bit of a mouthful in either language. Achashverosh is the king of Persia. His third year where he's settled in the throne, he makes a party for 187 days for his 127 provinces. So it's a book of excesses. Some people call it a comedy. Others believe it's a tragedy. It's been done as an opera. Some people believe it's history. Some people believe it's a book of fantasy. It's interesting. There's a lot of argument as to what kind of genre this book is. But as a story of excess, as a fantasy or comedy, we have Achashverosh as a drunken monarch engaged in this lengthy party. Of course, we're asking the question, who is actually governing these 127 provinces if you're busy being sloshed? And then he invites at the tail end of the party, when he's very sated with alcohol, he invites his wife Vashti to come in with her crown, showing in some way his dominance over her, that his crown is more important or is more powerful than hers, and she refuses. And because she refuses this male dominance, she's lauded by many as this amazing woman. I must tell you that I used to live in Newton, Massachusetts for many happy years, and one of my neighbors had a dog named Vashti. So I said, Sheila, help me understand why you named your dog Vashti. And she said, because the dog never listens. I was telling this story in New York when I was launching my book, and I could see there was a look of incredulity in the audience, but fortunately, another neighbor of ours was actually in the audience and was able to verify that this story is indeed true. So what I want to suggest in saying there could be no Esther without Vashti is that as an icon, the limit is that she wasn't able to change the culture. She became a victim. So it's true that she stood up to male dominance, but in so doing, not only did she fail and was she banished, or some believe that she was killed as a result of this, but there's a protocol that is spread out throughout all 127 provinces, ensuring that male dominance prevail over every household. So again, as women, we look at this and we laugh. You can make lots of proclamations, but that doesn't mean that anything is changing in the marital relationship between husband and wife. And yet the insecurity of men, particularly this reigning monarch, that if I, in my intimate marital spat, cannot hold power and I'm the king, what does this mean for every other household? I think Esther, who was regarded in this women's Bible, this suffragette women's Bible, as a passive character, was actually a very shrewd woman, because she understood, even at a tender age, she may have been 13 or 14 or 15, an early adolescent, as she assumes this position, perhaps she understood that because Vashti was killed for being a dominant presence, a presence who rejects male authority, that she needed to circumvent the regular channels and act as ostensibly a passive woman who then found her power in other ways. And to that end, I want to introduce another important set of ancient Middle Eastern folk tales that are later, but perhaps had an oral history that is a similar period, and that is 1001 Nights. So if you can't remember that storyline, I'll share it with you. In 1001 Nights, a king of a kingdom discovers that his brother's wife has been infidelitous, and then is alerted to his wife's own adultery. He's outraged by this, and he makes a proclamation that all virgins will be brought in the kingdom to him. He marries each one, he deflowers each one, and then he kills each one in the morning, and in that execution, preventing the woman from betraying him. Sorry about that little background noise. So he prevents women from betraying him. And he then exhausts all the possible virgins in his kingdom, except for the vizier's daughter, the vizier who's in charge of gathering all of these virgins. And as many of us know, Shahrazad had this charm. She volunteers herself for this position, and she actually tells the king such an amazingly mysterious and enigmatic story with all these cliffhangers that he postpones her execution for 1001 nights. And the difference in these stories is that, of course, she manipulates the king. She figures out how to both be the intriguing female beauty that he expects and the woman he does not expect, but she does that in order to service her own survival. As opposed to Esther, who actually, upon convincing from her uncle Mordecai, assumes a position of leadership and then uses her platform in order to save her people, rather than only saving herself. In fact, she's willing to die in order in order to make sure that others will live. So those are some background stories. And I want to talk about one more detail of this painting before we move on. And that is the small space between her hand and the palace gate, and the space that will signal every transformative change that is about to happen in her life. She's about to go into a space, and I want to think about that space, what I call the space before the door of anxiety. All of us go through, women and men, go through times of vulnerability when we face a door of anxiety and we don't know what's on the other side. That door of anxiety may be the door to a doctor's office when you're about to pick up a test result. It may be the door of the principal's office that either you're going through as a kid or you're going through as a parent. And either way, it's an anxious door. It may be a door where you're sitting and waiting for a job interview. It may be the door that you go through to your first home when you're married. It may be the door, your front door, as you're going into that space, knowing that things might be difficult for you on the other side. So I'd love whoever, I think it's Meredith, who, if you're navigating the handout, to go all the way to the end for a moment. Oh, sorry. Maybe it's up in the top. Sorry. Okay, right, down a little bit. Sorry, for traveling with me. Thank you for traveling with me. Down, reflective questions. So in what ways does beauty preoccupy me? When do I have a voice and when do I wish I had a voice? How do I operate within a space and transcend it? When I'm surrounded by new people in a new setting, how do I hold on to my identity and my values? So I think that these questions for me are lingering questions that have some resonance with the very important work that JWI does in thinking about how do I find my voice? When is my voice in some way clipped by my concerns about the externalities of my beauty? And to Botticelli's point about how I operate within a space and transcend it, when Esther transcends in size, transcends the walls, what it's saying is Esther may be in the palace, but she's not of the palace. She's actually found ways to overcome some of the limits of the position and the rigidity of the laws around her. So in talking about going through doors of anxiety, I just want to share with you an observation I had some years ago when I was doing some work on transitions and transformations. Most religions put rituals at a time of liminal space. And that might be a milestone event, the birth of a child, the death of a parent, a marriage. In Judaism, a bar bat mitzvah. These are times in between adolescence and adulthood, birth and viability, or life and death. And because those are liminal times in someone's life, we say we're going to put rituals there to help you manage that anxiety and to help bring community to help you manage that anxiety. So at death, we're going to have rituals of Shiva that will guide the behavior of the first day of mourning, the first 7 days of mourning, a marker for the 30th day, a marker for the end of the year, and then every subsequent year with what we call a yahrzeit, in order to help us remember and mark this loss as we move from being in partnership, from having a sibling, from having a spouse or partner, a child, God forbid, and not having one. We also have liminal spaces. And a door is the most liminal space that one could imagine architecturally, because it's, as Adrienne Rich talks about in her beautiful poem about doors and immigration, a door is not inside and it's not out. It's this in-between space. And we're not really sure what will happen on the other side. And to that point, we ritualize that door in Jewish life by putting a mezuzah on the door. The mezuzah has the Hebrew letter shin, which stands for Shaddai, which is God as the protector. And it has inside the Shema, the first paragraph of one of our central prayers, which signifies the mission statement of the Jewish people, as if to say, we almost always go through doors, even large doors alone, but we're not truly alone. We carry our God and our people with us as we go through the door. And so for Esther, she goes through this immense door of anxiety. She's actually in some way cushioned by the notion that she's bringing God with her into the space and carrying her people with her as well. So let's go down to the actual text of Esther. We have a few minutes to look at it. I just want to look at the English, if you mind. You can go down just a little bit more, and okay, great. So in the fortress, this is chapter 2. We meet Esther's uncle in the fortress Shushan. I would translate that as the capital city. Shushan lived a Jew, and he was a Jew who had been exiled. If you introduce yourself as an exile, if I come up to you and say, "Hi, Meredith," and you say, "Hi, what's your name?" And I say, "Hi, I'm Erica, and I'm an exile." What I'm telling you is, I may live here, but I'm really not from here. I'm not part of this. And he was a foster father to Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter. She had neither father nor mother. She was shapely and beautiful, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So we get a little background, and the first piece of background we get is that she has a foster parent because her parents are no longer. That tells us that she's in an extremely vulnerable position. And in fact, there are 3 ways in which she's vulnerable. She's vulnerable initially because she's a Jew, so she's part of a minority. That vulnerability will get enhanced when Haman makes his awful decree to destroy all the Jews. I believe, although there are people who believe that the New Testament is the first source of recorded anti-Semitism, I actually believe that it's here in the Book of Esther in 3:8, when Haman believes that because the Jewish people are different, they should not be tolerated. So Hadassah, Esther, is part of this vulnerable population because she is a Jew. Secondly, because she's a woman, and subject to being treated as an object. And that's actually her move from beauty to empowerment, is winning a beauty contest as subject, as someone who, as object rather, as someone who is looked at, as opposed to someone who acts in her life, who has agency. And that's who she becomes. She moves from subject to object. But she starts off as a Jew, as a woman, and as an orphan, all positions of vulnerability. And yet, even though she has all these strikes against her, she's able to lead. She's shapely and beautiful. This is important because it tells us that she creates a platform for herself. She gets noticed because she's beautiful, but she doesn't stop there. This same distinction is true of Joseph in the story. If you didn't read the Joseph in Genesis, you read it in, may have seen the play, where Joseph's beauty gets him noticed, and gets him a position. And it also is connected to danger, as it is for Esther, because the wife of Potiphar seduces him and is interested in him because he's beautiful. But of course, in order to have effect in the foreign court, you may get there because you're beautiful, but you're only going to stay there because you do something that is actually worthy of attention and worthy of change. So let's go down a little bit further in our last few minutes before your questions. I want to see an amazing scene again with Esther as object rather than subject. Mordecai finds out about this news, that the Jews are going to be destroyed. He tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth and ashes. He publicly, as a man of conviction, goes out into the public square. He bemoans the state of the Jewish people, and everyone rallies about him, the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. And through an intermediary, he lets Esther know. But at this point, Esther is so much a subject of the palace that she sent clothing for Mordecai to wear. She was greatly agitated, the verse says, but she was agitated about the wrong thing. She was agitated because Mordecai wasn't wearing the right clothes to the palace gate. But he refused. And in this moment, he actually tries to help her understand that externalities may get you somewhere in life, but they're not actually going to take you to where you need to be. In order to lead, you have to refuse the externalities and take a stand. So let's just go right to the bottom there. This is Esther's moment. 5:1-3, thank you, just right there, that's perfect. On the 3rd day of her fasting, when she decides, I'm going to approach the king unannounced, she puts on royal apparel, stands in the inner court of the king. She's not allowed to be there, But as soon as he saw her, instead of reproaching her, instead of putting her to death, as he might have done for Vashti for breaking the rules, he extends his golden scepter, and she approaches, and he says, "What troubles you? What is your request? Even up to half of the kingdom, it shall be granted to you." So I want to suggest, with the modern mindset of a Sheryl Sandberg, that when we lean in, we take a lot of anxieties with us. We're afraid to go through that door where we assert ourselves and what our needs are, to ask for that promotion, to stand up to domestic violence, to counter a rude remark or a kind of joke that puts us down. And then when we actually lean in, when we find our voice, when we do what was countercultural, when we ask for something that is by right ours, but we haven't asked for it yet, we might think that we're going to get punished. And in this instance, the king actually changes his tune. He sees her confidence. He sees what troubles her. And he actually says, "I'll give you up to half of the kingdom." That's the half of the kingdom that women should get. It's the equal salary. It's the equal rights. It's what we deserve. It's in an equal society where each gender gets half, or I would say every gender, up to half of the kingdom. Our requests are granted to us. But if we don't ask, we don't get. And I want to actually just, as I think about Esther, invite all of you who think perhaps that you don't have the voice, you don't have the power. This story, as old as it is, millennia old, is the subversion of the typical beauty contest. It's not the 1001 Nights. It's a story of survival and leadership, because we're not afraid, or we summon the courage and the clarity to ask for what should rightfully be ours. And with that Purim message, I turn it to you for questions, observations, and comments. Thank you so much for studying with me this afternoon.
Thank you. So at this point, I'd like to invite anyone who has a question to please just feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if you would feel more comfortable doing so in the chat box, and Erica will respond that way.
Yeah, or comments or disagreements or new readings or observations on the painting. I'd love to hear it all.
I'll start with something. So we have a new cohort that JWI is working on called the Jewish Communal Women's Leadership Project, and we're reading Iris Bonet's Gender Equity by Design. And it's something you said about being countercultural. She talks about the complication that women, when they do speak up in the workplace, when they do ask for a higher salary, when they do assert themselves, that is seen as being countercultural. And that, so on the one hand, we're telling women, speak up and assert yourself. And on the other hand, when they do, we're like, whoa, 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 we're not comfortable with that. You're supposed to be agreeable. So is there any lessons learned, or is that just part of the courage? Does that just speak to the courage that Esther needed to summon understanding all of that Ahasuerus is the ultimate, kind of bad boss.
Yeah. Really bad boss. Off with your head. That's a different kind of severance package, shall we say. It's a great question, Meredith, and I think it speaks to two things. One is, is how we're socialized to behave in settings where predominantly men speak. I was alerted to this. For those of you who read, it's a book that was written a long time ago. I think it was related in 1986 by Deborah Tannen. That's Not What I Meant. She's a linguist at Georgetown University. Has written a number of really important books about speaking, and she was observing the way men and women speaking in meetings, and even when women spoke less, they were perceived as speaking more than they did, of having more power than they did, and more aggression than they did. So I think there's the individual aspect of your question, which is, when am I stopping myself, self-censoring, because I'm very conscious that that women shouldn't be speaking at this moment. I'll say this, it's very common, even when I've been talking about my book in audiences, and even audiences, I would say, which are half men and half male and half female, that almost exclusively the questions get asked by males. I actually was alerted to, as a professor, this is obvious, we feel in the classroom all the time. And so sometimes we have to invite women to ask questions, which feels patronizing. And yet the other side, if I don't ask, I'm not going to get women to actually come forward and say what they really think about an issue and how they read something. So this idea of hearing the voice to enable other people to hear the voice. And this came to me, I can't remember the author's name, but many, many years ago, a journalist wrote a piece on why more men write op-eds than women. And she said, women tend to need to be invited. And if you invite a woman to give her opinion, she will give it. But when women give it and it's unsolicited, it's perceived often as being overly assertive. I think what Esther is teaching us, I think in this model, Vashti was so overly assertive that people couldn't actually hear her. Esther had somehow figured out that sweet spot. But I think we can't be afraid of that. And the second point to your question, Meredith, is structurally, have we created the kind of spaces where, not individually, but structurally, created spaces where women can't succeed? For example, we might say, I'm not prepared to be on a board unless half of the board are women. I know Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, has taken a public stand that he will not speak on any panel where there's not an equal representation of men and women. So those are statements which say, by design, you need to be thinking this way. And I think there are all kinds of small fixes where we can alert people to that. And I've taken that policy myself. I'm not prepared to be the token woman in an anthology. I'm not prepared to be the token woman on a panel, or there's 2 women and 5 men. And people say, oh, well, it's really hard to find women. It's like, not if you look. All right, so second question from Stephanie, what are your thoughts on how beauty is recognized throughout the story? So I tried to compare it, and I speak about this more at length in the book, that beauty is, there's a genre in biblical and scholarship of Jews who operate in foreign courts. And that would be Joseph, Esther, Mordecai. Some believe that Moses is there, although we have less text on him. And then later Daniel, which is a much later book in our scriptures. And in those stories, beauty is what gets people noticed. And I think in some way, it's just a truth in the society that we live in, that beauty creates access. And then the question is what you do with that access. The access point is always in a foreign court. It's not in Jewish terms. We do have characters who are described as beautiful, whether that's Tamar or Sarah, because there are characters that are described in terms of their beauty. But it's not what creates access. So that's really kind of in a foreign setting in text. And I don't know, even though these texts are very, very old, I don't know that things have changed that much in terms of beauty creating access. I'm interested in your own thoughts on this. I wish it weren't so. Nor am I advocating for it to be so. It just seems to be the external measure. Meredith and I have just been in some conversation about this topic of how we shift that.
Erica, this keeps so I don't know if you saw Rabbi Ruttenberg, I believe it was, tweeted out something the other day about Mordecai being a sex trafficker. And I'm wondering what you think of that reading. It's something that, is it problematic what Mordecai did? Was it helpful? Was he helping Esther by putting her in this position? Are we giving too modern a reading of this story? Are we complicating it by, but I don't know. It's just, ever since I read that tweet, it's been troubling me, and it's making it hard for me to kind of appreciate the story.
Yeah. So I think that is very disturbing. I have not heard that reading, and I'm actually just looking at the text right now so that I want to be accurate to this. So I don't think that that's a textually accurate reading. I think that there's no sex trafficking. The king created a decree that all virgins be brought to the palace. There was no choice, nor did Esther hand her over, nor did Mordecai hand Esther over. So I'm just going to read to you the actual text. When the king's order and edict was proclaimed, this is from 2:8, and when many girls were assembled in the fortress Shushan under the supervision of Haggai, Esther too was taken into the king's palace. So it doesn't say that Mordecai handed her over. That's, in fact, if anything, it's the exact opposite. Mordecai is introduced as her omain, which in Hebrew is actually a nursing father, that's what we, but as a caregiver. So in contrast to Mordecai as a caregiver and protector, she was lakha, she was taken. That Hebrew word is a very strong word, to be forcibly taken into something. So although I love Rabbi Rottenberg's words, and I have to kind of understand where she gets this interpretation from, I do really want to question it from textual accuracy here. I think we often do read texts with, modern sort of readings. I'll give you an example. There are people who say Jonah, the prophet, was depressed. So we didn't really have, it's a little bit of it's a little bit of an imposition, a modern imposition on the text, although I could understand someone reading it that way. Although in this case, I don't see a textual basis for that reading at all. I think, if anything, get mad at the structure that the governmental structure that would allow this to happen. And I do believe that the Book of Esther is a referendum on foreign governments, and this idea of this kind of power for taxation, power of excess, taking virgins. I want to say one of the things that I've focused a lot on in terms of those adult readings is that there was a second harem. All these young women who are gathered were deflowered and then were not sent home. They were all sent to a second harem. For those of you who want a kind of bigger picture of this, Gore Vidal has his novel Xerxes, where I really got a fictional sense of what it might have been like to be shunted off into some place and not called. That's why Esther says, the king hasn't called me for 30 days. Even after he's married to her, he still takes different women to sleep with every night, which was the Persian custom. That's what we should be upset about: women being taken forcibly into these kind of environments and never allowed to live normal lives. Ellie asked, what kind of lessons do you think men can learn from this story? And Jane said, was Esther able to have a voice that was received by the king because she's not only beautiful, but also so young? Vashti was presumably older and wiser, but tired and fed up. The king may have been more willing to listen to Esther. So, both of those are interesting comments. I just want to take Jane's first, and we'll go back to Ellie's. I don't know how old any women are in this text. I can only imagine that all of them are relatively young. I don't know how old Vashti was. And I don't know if the king listened to Esther because she was a pretty young thing, or because she was the only one who actually asserted her voice, which is the way that I read it. She actually said something to the king, and the king could have punished her for it. We do have in the apocryphal reading, which are books written about the same time, but weren't canonized in our, what we call the Masoretic text. We have an apocryphal version of Esther confronting the king, and the king being extremely angry at her. And you're thinking we're going to have a replay of the Vashti scene, and then God intervening and making Achashverosh kinder. To Ellie's point, in terms of male lessons, I think it's really about checking male power. It's about how men look at women and whether they're regarding women as subject or object, and when they are regarding them as object, how they switch that reading. And and being able to recognize leadership. One, to me, one of the most empowering moments in the biblical text is after Esther says, "If I die, I die," and I'm willing to confront the king. It says that she orders Mordecai and up to this point, Esther has been listening. She has been the one commanded. She finds a voice and then begins to command the male lead in this story, which to me is very significant. I don't know what's happening in this office right now. Sorry. Talia says, I found it interesting that there are many times at the beginning where Esther does as Mordecai tells her, he calls out the shots, and by the end, he does what exactly my point. But it actually happens earlier. It happens in chapter 4, at the end of chapter 4. So it doesn't happen towards the end. And I also want to note, because we're getting to the end of our call, that the book is named after her. The book is named after her. And I think because in many ways, Mordecai and Haman are the static characters. Mordecai is always good. Haman is always bad. Esther is really the dynamic character who undergoes the most transformation. And I think in every time we make decisions as empowered women, as Jewish women, we're actually acting in some way in Esther's shadow, in this voice at a time. Remember, Esther is thousands of years old, this story, and yet it's canonized. And it gives this very, what we might call a modern reading. If you are in a vulnerable population, you are an orphan, you are a woman, you are a Jew, don't let that stop you. In fact, let it be those things which that vulnerability, accessing that vulnerability, opening it up and finding strength in your voice and knowing that your voice really can change history. Thank you. Happy Purim to you all.
I can think of no other more perfect way to end this call than with that message, and no better way to spend Purim and celebrate International Women's Day than to study this text together. So Erica, I thank you. We will be emailing everyone a recording of this conversation, as well as a link again to purchase Erica's book, which I will be getting today. We are also, on another note, we are still, as of now, still having our event at the Israeli Embassy this Monday. For any of you who are in DC, I hope you will join us. And we are confirming more virtual leadership lunches coming up. Hopefully one I'm working on with a young woman who was recruited to work for the CIA, Jewish woman, while she was a sorority student in college. So we're going to hear her story. So I thank you all. I wish you a happy, happy Purim. Thank you again to Erica, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Meredith, so much. And thank you all for the work that you do on behalf of JWI.